So this is a re-upload of the Final Fantasy IV and V video. There was a mistake towards the end of the video, so I fixed it. Thanks to the people in the comments of the original that pointed this out. Anyway, enjoy the video. Welcome back to the Final Fantasy review series, I guess that's what I'll call it. Last time we looked at the Famicom trilogy, and today we're going to be looking at the Super Nintendo era of Final Fantasy. Well, kinda. We're looking at the first two games on the Super Nintendo. Final Fantasy VI will get its own video. Final Fantasy III was released on April 27th of 1990. Later that year, the Super Famicom would be released, and everywhere else would get it the following year. Final Fantasy IV would start as a Famicom game, but because the Super Nintendo released, it would be reworked into a game for the new console. And apparently, it was 80% done before getting turned into an SNES game. But the game would be released in July of 1991 in Japan, and later that year, it would be released in North America. Now, I know the box and cartridge says Final Fantasy II, but it's Final Fantasy IV. They called the North American release 2 because the real Final Fantasy II and 3 wasn't originally released in North America. So they called it 2 so nobody would get confused. This decision ended up confusing people in the long run because when Final Fantasy II and 3 eventually got released in North America, they were called Final Fantasy II and 3. Later re-releases would call Final Fantasy IV by its real name. But I still see people who don't understand all of this. It didn't help that when Final Fantasy Origins released on PS1, the back of the box stated that it contains Final Fantasy II, which was never released in America. They were right, but they didn't explain that 4 was called 2 in America, so I can imagine some people thought, yeah it was, not knowing. Just like the previous games in the series, there have been many re-releases of Final Fantasy IV. It's on GBA, PlayStation, DS, PSP, and more. I've owned a copy of the PSP version for over a year now. It was given to me as a gift. I just never got around to playing it. For this video, I chose to play the original release of Final Fantasy IV. I also played a bit of the PSP version. I was originally going to only play the PSP version, but for some reason I really wanted to play the original version of this game. The intro of Final Fantasy IV is incredible. It introduces the players to most of the main characters, and shows us what the relationships between the characters are. And unlike Final Fantasy II, where I couldn't really care about the characters because I didn't know anything about them, in 4 there are times where the characters will stop and talk to each other. It's still not perfect, and there are some characters who don't go through any character development, but it's a huge step up compared to the Famicom games. And for a lot of players in the 90s, I can imagine this was the first time they've ever played a game with a story like this, one with drama and plot twists. While this story was unique for the time, looking at it now, the story is not very good, in my opinion I should stress. While I found the story more interesting than the previous games, like I said, not every character is good. For example, Edge joins the party pretty late in the game and doesn't really do anything. But my biggest problem with this game's plot is how many fake out moments there are. Moments like when Sid apparently blows himself up but he's actually fine, or when you beat Golbez but there's actually another boss who's the real final boss. It made all the build up to Golbez feel kind of pointless. At a certain point, I stopped taking the plot seriously because it might have looked like that person died, but they might end up being completely fine. And this isn't a point against nor towards the plot, it's just something I thought about when playing the game. Cecil and the rest of the group have to be some of the most unluckiest people ever. It felt like every time something went right for them, immediately after, everything would go wrong. Sometimes it would be their fault though, like this. So overall, the plot was okay. A huge step up from the Famicom games, but it isn't the best story ever or anything, in my opinion, again. I just want to make that clear. I bet this game and story means a lot to a bunch of people. But even though I didn't think the story was amazing, gameplay-wise, this might be my favorite of the 4 games I've talked about so far. So apparently, one of the reasons why casual consumers in the West didn't like RPGs was because they thought turn-based combat was boring. So Square, wanting more people to play their games, stopped making Final Fantasy turn-based, at least for a while. Starting with 4, the series would use the active time battle system. Everything happens in real time now, enemies won't wait for you to choose what you want to do. This makes the battles faster paced. While most random encounters aren't anything special, boss fights are now way more interesting and fun. Spells now have to be charged and are instant, meaning you have to strategize more. The stronger the spell is, the longer it has to charge, so sometimes I found myself using weaker spells just because they charged quicker. While I just said you had to strategize more in this game, that's only if you play another version of this game. While Final Fantasy IV is a pretty easy game no matter which version you play, unless it's the DS remake, because from what I've heard that version is much harder. I remember hearing once in an old YouTube video that the North American release made some enemies do less damage. I'm not sure if that's true though, let me know if it is. That's not the only thing they changed. The script, while not terrible, is imperfect, and there are clearly things censored or not translated the best. This version also removes some of the characters' unique abilities. In the Japanese version and the re-releases, each character had their own unique ability they could use during battles, but not in the North American release. Not every character's ability is useful. I never used Cid's scan ability, so I don't really mind that some of them are gone, honestly. The only one I sort of miss is Cecil's darkness ability. It was really good at beating early game encounters. I heard they did this to make it simpler and easier to understand for newcomers, since RPGs weren't popular in America. I get wanting to ease in newcomers, but if you ask me, Final Fantasy IV without these changes is already a game that's great for people who are new to the genre. Story progression was pretty linear, there's no job system, party members learn new spells by leveling up so you don't have to buy them like in the previous games, and like I said, the game isn't very hard. Again, unless you play the DS remake. I'm not going to say Final Fantasy IV is the best game to start with if you want to get into the series, because I haven't played every game yet, but it's a good place to start, as long as you're okay with dealing with some annoying dungeons. The dungeons in this game for the most part are good, but there are a few that have some annoying gimmicks or moments in them, like floors that damage your whole party, or not being able to use metal equipment. But I never got that annoyed because for the first time in the series, there are save points in dungeons. The save points obviously let you save your progress, but you can also use a tent that lets you restore some of your health and MP. I know I played the Pixel remasters for 2 and 3, so dungeon crawling wasn't really that bad during my playthroughs of those games. But being able to restore health and MP by only using one item instead of multiple is just more convenient. And considering Final Fantasy III was the last game I'm going to be playing the Pixel remaster for, having save points in dungeons is going to be helpful. Another reason why I never got sick of dungeons was because of this game's amazing soundtrack. I love Final Fantasy IV's OST, it's incredible. A few of my favorites are Into the Darkness, and the amazing boss theme. Final Fantasy IV is my favorite of the games I've played for this series of videos so far. While the original version is very easy and I personally didn't enjoy the story that much, the gameplay easily makes up for that. But I recommend if you want to play this game, play another version of it. I'd recommend the PSP version for the new updated graphics alone. But this version also includes the After Years on it, which from what I understand is a sequel game, kind of like 10-2 or 13-2. But no matter how you decide to play Final Fantasy IV, it's an amazing game. Final Fantasy V was probably the game I was looking forward to playing the most. In the last Final Fantasy video, I said I really liked the job system in Final Fantasy III. Final Fantasy V brings back the job system and apparently makes it even better. But before we get into the game, I should mention I'm playing the Game Boy Advance version of this game. The GBA version adds a few extra dungeons and boss fights. The original release on Super Famicom wasn't released in North America because Square thought the game would be too hard for Western players. So instead, we got Mystic Quest. I might get around to playing that one day, but for now I'm sticking to numbered entries. The first North American release of Final Fantasy V would be on the PlayStation when it was a part of the Final Fantasy Anthology collection. I was originally going to play this version, but when it was translated, they turned Ferris into a generic pirate character, and I can barely read what Ferris is saying half the time. Thankfully, the Game Boy Advance version fixed that. There was a mobile version, the enemy sprites look really good, but I hate the UI. The only other release I know of is the Pixel Remaster. Before the Pixel Remaster was released, this game was not very accessible. I've talked to a lot of people who've played a bunch of the other Final Fantasy games, but not 5, and that's a shame, because Final Fantasy V is really good. Like I said, Final Fantasy V brings back the job system from Final Fantasy III, and the people who told me that it's better in 5 were right. For the most part, the job system in 5 is the same as it was in the Pixel Remaster of 3, but there are a few changes that makes Final Fantasy V one of the most replayable and fun RPGs I've ever played. Now after a job levels up a few times, the party member learns a permanent ability. They can use this ability while trying to learn another job. For example, this means you can have a party member who is a warrior that focuses on physical attacks, but if that party member was, say, a black mage before a warrior, and you leveled that job up enough, the warrior can also be really good at using magic. And that's just one example. But the best job in the game is the one each party member starts as, a freelancer. At first, the freelancer isn't really good at anything, but if a party member masters a job, and then you swap them back to a freelancer, you can use that job's ability, without needing to equip it. So that, on top of the abilities you can change whenever you want in the menu, I was having so much fun combining abilities together to make the best team I could. With enough experimenting, you can find combinations that let you attack 8 times in one turn, or cast really strong magic attacks. It felt like I was breaking the game. A quick Google search showed me that there are a bunch of really good job combinations, so I'm going to have to play this game again and try more job combinations. But I think the developers knew about this stuff, because Final Fantasy V is the hardest game so far. The previous games had their moments where they got difficult, but there were many moments in 5 where my whole party would go down in just a few attacks. This is the first game since Final Fantasy 1 where random encounters were giving me trouble. I guess some later encounters in 2 did, but anyway. The random encounters in this game felt like they were preparing me for the boss fights in this game. The boss fights are challenging, but they were always satisfying to beat. The active time battle system returns, and it's pretty much the same as it was in 4. The only differences I noticed were the bars next to each party member's name, showing you when their next turn will be, and spells don't charge anymore. I personally prefer the spells having charge times, like in 4, it made me strategize a bit more. But I think 5 being more difficult and having the improved job system easily makes up for that. Also, from Final Fantasy 2 onwards, you can move your party members to the front or back row. And depending on what row they were in, it would change how much damage they did or took from physical attacks. In Final Fantasy V, that also applies to enemies. Bosses like the Sandworm used this to make them a bit more interesting. Dungeons in 5 were also pretty good. I didn't think any of them overstayed their welcome, and none of them had any annoying moments in them. So gameplay wise, Final Fantasy V is great, and is what people bring up when they talk about how good this game is. I never hear anyone talk about the game's story, and after playing the game, I think I know why. Compared to Final Fantasy IV, and especially later titles, the plot and characters are very simple. The characters don't get much development, and the story seems to be more focused on telling jokes than a serious story. But I didn't mind that much. I found the story in Final Fantasy V fun to go through. Players who want a more serious story in their RPGs probably won't enjoy the story of this game that much, but I enjoyed the story and thought the funny moments made up for the lack of character development. There is one element of this game's story I don't hear a lot of people talking about. Spoilers for this game and Final Fantasy VII, even though most people know this about 7.
A lot of people talk about how in Final Fantasy VII one of the party members die in the story, but Final Fantasy V was actually the first game in the series where a party member that is set up to be a permanent member dies.
But Final Fantasy VII was the first time where it mattered. In Final Fantasy VII, Aerith's death impacted the story and characters. Also, you lost your best healer. In Final Fantasy V, Galif's death impacts pretty much nothing. Kryl is obviously sad for a bit after her grandfather passed away, but that's it. After Galif dies, Kryl takes his place in the party and she gets all of his job levels and abilities, so it didn't leave much of an impact.
Thanks to the comments on the original upload, I was reminded that Tella does die. But he didn't feel like a permanent party member like Galif did, at least to me. Also, none of the characters in Final Fantasy II who died felt like a permanent party member either. Thank you, comments, for pointing that out.
Final Fantasy V was an amazing game that I can't wait to replay. The job system is even better than it was in 3, and the story, while not being the most serious, was still enjoyable. So my original plan was to make this video about all 3 of the numbered Final Fantasy games on Super Nintendo, but I ended up having a lot more to talk about when I started writing about the next game. So next time we talk about Final Fantasy, we'll be looking at Final Fantasy VI. See you then.